Introduction, Part 3. As the Viet Cong troops demonstrated their ability to attack in battalion and even regimental strength, despite suffering large losses, as had been the pattern at the end of the French War, too, and as the large influx of American forces seemed to do little more than stem the communist tide, it seemed apparent that the protracted and tragic conflict in South Vietnam could not be won in the final analysis by either the communists or the American-backed South Vietnamese. Although the war, in the most important sense, was a political one, in military terms the advantage the Viet Cong retained on the ground was countered by the American-Vietnamese advantage in the air and at sea. But it was significant that while the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese compatriots suffered an estimated 27,000 killed in 1965 alone, the monthly rate of infiltration from the north by year's end was about equal to that figure on an annual basis. It was true that the more American troops were sent to Vietnam, even though the rate of increase and effectiveness of new elements would be limited through the summer of 1966 by a difficult logistics problem, particularly in the clogged ports, the greater the number of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese casualties could be anticipated. And as more American and South Vietnamese mobile striking forces moved out on large-scale hunt-and-kill operations from their enclave bases, and as more steady day and night patrols were mounted to keep the enemy off balance, the greater the risk the Communists would be taking in meeting the Allied efforts head-on in regimental or divisional-sized battles. Yet it was a risk they seemed willing to take, as they gravitated between small-scale guerrilla-type actions and the commitment of larger elements, as in the big battle in the Ia Drang Valley near the Cambodian border in the fall of 1965. Further, as the Viet Cong's strength, bolstered by the North Vietnam infiltrated regulars, continued to grow, even the heavy influx of American troops did not provide the ratio of 8 or 10 to 1 superiority to a guerrilla force that military men consider necessary to defeat such an enemy. At the start of 1966, the ratio was less than 4 to 1. There were also serious political factors. Following the overthrow of the Diem regime in November 1963, there had been a lack of stability in the Saigon government, which suffered a series of coups and counter-coups that resulted in one shaky military or civilian regime replacing another, until mid-1965, when Air Force Marshal Key became prime minister as the representative of a new compromise military directorate. This lack of stability had severely inhibited the ability of the South Vietnamese to prosecute the war successfully in the countryside. The Key regime managed to survive longer than was expected, but it was more of an expedient makeshift than a firm government. The military men supporting it did so more out of the belated realization that they better hang together or hang separately than out of any real zeal or capacity to create a viable governmental machinery. Although the South Vietnamese forces were better equipped with arms and ammunition, modern weapons, and planes, the Viet Cong guerrillas, while there were signs that their ranks had been somewhat shattered and weakened politically as well as militarily, still seemed to have the greater will to win. The same sort of fanatic dedication that they had learned from the Chinese communists developed against the French and refined for themselves after 1958. And in the spring of 1966, on the government side, there were still only the beginnings of a workable pacification scheme in the countryside. The efforts that were being made to rally the people through effective self-help and assistance schemes were limited, essentially, to 4 key enclaves: around Da Nang in the north, in Binh Dinh province on the central coast, around Saigon, which remained a critical and highly Viet Cong-infested zone, and in An Giang, a province bordering Cambodia in the west. The tremendous task of pacification, of moving from the establishment of security in small areas to a stage of real rural reconstruction, seemed almost insurmountable, both bureaucratically and morally, and even the most optimistic observers thought it would take 5 years or more to pacify even a third of the country. The blunt fact alone that the Viet Cong still controlled 2/3 of South Vietnam geographically and at least 23% of the population outright and another 20% or so indirectly through propaganda and sporadic terror emphasized the long-term difficulties faced by the South Vietnamese government, even with continued American help. At the same time, in the United States, there was growing confusion about our role in South Vietnam, and differences of opinion as to whether we should remain there or get out had become intense by the end of 1965. A vocal body of public opinion, expressed in Congress, in academic circles, and in the press, seemed to be in favor of pulling out and negotiating the best possible settlement. Other influential leaders, including the administration's policymakers, continued to maintain that the war had to be more fully prosecuted. On the ground in South Vietnam and with sustained air attacks on the north, including attacks on industrial targets hitherto held inviolate, on the port of Haiphong, and even on Hanoi itself, as a legitimate reprisal for North Vietnam's direction and support of the guerrilla movement in the South, and as a way to force the communists to the conference table. As a prelude to the first of the regular air attacks on the North in February 1965, a documentation of the direction of the Southern guerrillas by the North Vietnamese had been issued in the form of an American white paper, which purported to prove in considerable detail that Hanoi had for years infiltrated men and supplies into the South, and that it had from the outset been giving military as well as political orders to the National Liberation Front. The Front was the clandestine group in the southern jungle that, as the political arm of the Viet Cong, claimed to be an independent revolutionary body, and it was complemented in 1965 by the formation of the People's Revolutionary Party, an alleged separate counterpart of the Lao Dang or Workers' Party of North Vietnam. Even though the direct ties of the Southern Communists to those in the North were clear, and while there was no doubt that North Vietnam was steadily infiltrating soldiers and supplies into South Vietnam, and probably furnishing the grand strategy for the military conflict there, it was also a fact that the Viet Cong were still very much a Southern revolutionary force in its own right. For a long time, the Southern guerrillas had to fend for themselves. Their arms had either been crudely manufactured in jungle arsenals or been weapons captured from the South Vietnamese forces, mostly American ones. Beginning in late 1964, however, new Soviet-type arms manufactured in China regularly began flowing into South Vietnam. These improvised weapons, as well as some shipped from Communist Europe, became the main source of the guerrillas' arsenal. By the end of 1965, virtually the entire arsenal of the Communists fighting in the South was the so-called China family of 7.62 millimeter weapons, and this made the Viet Cong more than ever dependent on the North. No longer was it possible to replenish ammunition by capturing South Vietnamese or American stockpiles, and from this time on almost everything in the way of military supplies had to be brought into South Vietnam by jungle trails from the north or along the coast by sea. By the end of 1965, partly because of this new dependence on the North, some observers saw signs of growing differences among the National Liberation Front, Hanoi, and Peking about the method of prosecuting the war and even about larger questions of negotiations. Some, but not all, of these differences reflected the traditional Vietnamese fears of Chinese domination. There also seemed the possibility that some members of the front were eager for a respite from the fighting and bombing in order to avoid further damage to the painfully built-up communist apparatus in South Vietnam, which was being subjected to incalculable stresses as a result of the unexpected might of the American war effort. Having promised victory in the summer of 1965 and having been unable to produce it, the Viet Cong were now facing the consequences of having failed to keep their pledge to the peasants. There were clear indications from captured prisoners of an increased use of terror in the villages, where inexperienced communist cadres, hastily recruited, were using strong-arm methods instead of quiet political persuasion in collecting taxes and conscripting fresh guerrilla manpower. However, If they did have differences in private, Peking, Hanoi, and the National Liberation Front continued to speak publicly in one voice in loudly denouncing the Americans and insisting that the war against the new colonialism be pushed to its conclusion.